A pleasure to meet all at last. Welcome back once again to films I should have talked about years ago. So for this instance, we're going to take ourselves a bit of a step back from 2018 and probably go to the 90s once again, because I get the feeling we're going to have plenty more to work on coming forward. With the holidays and all that have been going around lately, we might have to do some other stuff, especially because I might not get dressed as much for the occasion, but I will definitely have lots more to talk about here. So let's go ahead and talk about Ferngully, The Last Rainforest. So what better way to talk about this film than to get started right about now? So, Ferngully, The Last Rainforest. Fairies living in an Australian rainforest, the last of its kind, so to speak. But then humans start showing up when the fairies bring about the thoughts to make them think that they were extinct when they're really not, and it turns out it's even worse than they thought. A logging company comes around, starts chopping down the trees, and there's a guy who draws red X's with a can of spray paint before eventually tripping over, losing his music player to the woods, and essentially being forced to shrink down because he grabs one fairy in his hands. Yeah, I feel like I'm going a little too fast with this one, so we'll just get started here. Ferngully, The Last Rainforest takes place in Australia in what is known as Ferngully. This, of course, is the reference to a certain location in a certain rainforest in the oceanic region known as the smallest continent on Earth, Australia. We have our main protagonist, a female fairy known by the name of Krista. She, of course, has herself a not so unique interpretation for what she is as a character, but played by Samantha Matthews. I feel like that she does alright in her role here, but maybe they could have had a bit more of the emotional angle, especially for certain scenes. Well, anyways, though, there's a bird that comes around, tries to grab onto her, and her friends thankfully come by and save her. Krista does, however, have the knowledge, quote-unquote, that humans are actually extinct, and that the fairies are basically the last ones that are like humans living on Earth. However, it eventually comes to fruition that information about that is going to come up in the form of a massive series of quakes. These quakes that rock Ferngully turn out to be a massive machine from a certain logging company. They're operated by two men, followed by a third guy whom is marking the trees with some red spray paint. Giant X's on the trees indicate which trees to cut down and process into lumber, possibly meant for consumerism in the cities and towns and whatnot. But what happens is that the spray paint guy, known as Zach, played by Jonathan Ward, ends up going into the forest and capturing what seems to be a firefly in his hands. When he sees what's inside, turns out it's Krista herself. And as a tree starts to come down, threatening to crush Zach, she shrinks him down to her size. And while this does prevent him from getting crushed to death, he unfortunately ends up in just as bad of a predicament. He gets caught in a web attached to the tree, and the tree itself is being engulfed by the mulching device inside the machine itself. So, with some quick thinking, as well as some assistance from a new friend known as Batty the Bat, played by Robin Williams, I'd say he's the real star of the show here, apart from what he did in Aladdin, Good Will Hunting, and whatnot. The three manage to escape and head back to Ferngully, in which that Zach regains consciousness and at first believes that he's in some sort of dream or fantasy, but is eventually convinced that he was shrunken down by Krista's magic powers. She unfortunately can't quite get him back to full size though, after shrinking him down to her size. But while it doesn't get very good for them, blood-wise or relationship-wise, the two do eventually form a synergy with each other, especially when they head back to Ferngully and Zach ends up showcasing his music player, which was apparently brought in by a kangaroo that the fairies know pretty well. This music player, which the fairies don't quite know about how it operates, but Zach himself turns it on and plays a lively tune. I should probably mention right at this point that there's a lot of musical elements in this film just as much. And I will say that they do a pretty good job with giving us some musical bits to add on to the runtime, which is rather short for what it is, but I mean, it's not exactly meant for a theatrical release, but direct-to-video releases seem just as nice for what they are. There's a certain charm one might get from seeing certain cult films of the 80s and 90s. In any case, though, Zack, unfortunately, starts to wonder about where the rest of his guys are and the logging company that associates with them. Meanwhile, the machine itself, which are operated by two guys inside, ends up getting purged by some sort of pollution. Because it turns out there was some sort of evil essence hovering in the air. A creature that feeds on pollution known as Hexus, and he himself is played by the one and only Tim Curry. Just think about it for a minute. This was about the same time that Home Alone 2 came out, and a couple years after his famous role as Pennywise the Dancing Clown came around. But, of course, in this film, he does a pretty decent job for what it is, but I can't quite say it's nearly as good, particularly because Hexus doesn't have that much dialogue to work with, and doesn't exactly have all that much to offer apart from just being a weapon of pollution, threatening to kill off the forest and Ferngully from within. So, what do we have to do here? Well, it turns out that an elder, a grandmother of the fairies, introduces a certain magic of hers before dissipating into fairy dust. The fairy dust is able to turn the greenish auras of the fairy family into a bluish sort of tone, which in essence creates a unique power that apparently is strong enough to fight off against Hexus and the logging company itself. The machine in which that is now under the control of Hexus threatens to truly take down Ferngully once and for all. But when the fairies do manage to fight back, Zack himself would jump in to help as well, in the form of hitching a ride with Batty and making his way down to the machine. He's able to get through, especially being that he had a quarrel with one fairy himself, who was at first Krista's best friend and possibly lover. But even after this quarrel, they do eventually learn to work together, and Zack is able to shut off the machine by switching off the ignition key. But apparently, while this is enough to disable Hexus, it doesn't do so for very long. The fairies do cheer off for the machine being shut down and Hexus possibly being defeated, but surprise, surprise, he comes right on back and being just as menacing as before, this time taking on a full body. So that's actually a pretty nice twist there. In addition to taking over a machine, he now takes over nature itself, just so he can put an end to Ferngully, which is considered the last rainforest according to this film's plot. Well, in any case though, Zack did his part to stop Hexus, but now Krista, after all the absolution she had with Zack when realizing that he was working for the logging company this whole time and essentially killing the forest from within, she puts all that behind her though and uses the power of the others in order to power herself up and go deep inside the body that Hexus had manifested into. And upon overloading this body, it essentially breaks him down and puts him deep in the earth, sealing him inside of what is known as a large tree forever. At least that's just what they hope would happen here. It's not exactly a climactic way to stop the main antagonist, especially for a film like this. Not very climactic, but for what it is and the long, somewhat short time that it has, it does work in its own right. And being that Tim Curry probably didn't get paid very much, I guess they had to come up with something in order to have Hexus defeated. In any case though, Zack is once again welcomed back into the fairies, but he chooses to leave instead, preferring to go back to his own life. And Krista sends him with a parting gift, a seed in which that the elder had explained how all growth begins with a single seed. That is a kind of quote that I feel like nobody should ever leave behind. As for Batty and everybody else, well, they just go back and return to their normal life in Ferngully, hopefully never having another problem like this again. There was a sequel that would come out a little while after known as Ferngully 2, The Magical Rescue. But that, of course, is a story for another day, because I can imagine with this one being not so great for what it is, the sequel probably is not that much better. So that's an entire can of whatever that I'll probably dig into some other time. But for Ferngully The Last Rainforest, it's not a bad cult film, but I can't say it's all that great though. Kind of somewhere in between here. 5.9 out of 10.1. So whether that's a good enough score for you or not, I'm just here to say, I'm here to review films. Films I could have talked about in my primordial days on YouTube in 2008 and 2013, but I never quite did so. There were a lot of other films though that I have talked about, and I made an entirely different series on that, which currently has 2 seasons. I might create a 3rd season though in the future. Until then though, that's it for films I should have talked about years ago. So make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.